Hi, everyone. It looks like we just have a couple minutes till the top of the hour. We'll be starting presentation in just a few minutes. Okay, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today, providing a drug testing, legal, and regulatory update for employers. This webinar is brought to you by Orange Tree Employment Screening, and the presentation will be given by Nina French, Managing Partner of the Current Consulting Group. Nina has been a longstanding member of the employee screening community, advising clients on drug testing strategy and occupational health and wellness operations. After the presentation, Nina will definitely be available to answer any questions you might have and to continue the conversation. You can type a question in the chat window and we'll read it out loud after the presentation. Before Nina's webinar, Jeff Ernst, Orange Tree's VP of Sales and Marketing, will give an update on what's new at Orange Tree. Jeff also invites you to text in any questions you might have to 952-237-7471. Thank you all for joining us. Jeff, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And if you're in Minneapolis, we got a foot of snow, and I won't go into all of the weather like we had on our last webinar, but it just is a bunch of fun here in Minneapolis. Hope you are doing well wherever you are. And Nina, thank you quickly here in advance for joining us today. We're really looking forward to the content that you have to provide. Since the primary subject of today's call is drug testing, I wanted to take a few moments to review several items about Orange Tree. Oops. You getting some feedback, Suzanne? About Orange Tree and our offerings and capabilities which may be of interest to you. The instant value drug test is one that you would administer yourself. We've talked about this in the past, but I want to give another update on it with some more information. And the reasons you might consider such an approach are pretty straightforward and meaningful. You can save money and enable candidates to start doing their work sooner. If a candidate's test is negative, then they go to work. If it's non-negative, then you have them scheduled for a traditional drug test to confirm the results. It almost goes without saying that, like services in our business, in this industry, this approach isn't a one-size-fits-all. It may not be practical for your business. There may be prevailing law that prohibits you from using this approach. But the point is, however, to make you aware of an offering that can save you money if you determine it is a fit for you. So moving on to our next slide, we're going to get a bit more specific on the pricing. And this next chart shows you the cost of an instant oral 10-panel test. The calculations are pretty straightforward. 500 tests at $16 each equals $8,000 in cost, assuming that there's a 10% non-negative rate, which is higher than most of our clients experience, but used to depict kind of a worst case scenario relative to cost. 50 candidates would have to also take the standard 10-panel urine test. As the table shows, we have included the service and collection fees, so you can see the total cost of using the instant oral test. The next slide here, what we've done is added the standard urine test approach. So assuming that you would just go about drug testing the way you probably are today, and always have, which is certainly fine, and maybe, again, the best option for you, you can see the pricing that would be your charge or total cost paid for the same 500 tests. So finally, when you look at the bottom line, you can see that there is money to be saved by taking the instant value drug test. So if you'd like more information on this offering and how it might help you, how it could be applicable within your environment, please include a comment in our webinar chat window or contact your Orange Tree sales rep or client success partner. You're also welcome, obviously, to text me. Still on the theme of drug testing, but a little bit different discussion point, and that is to technology. Getting through the drug testing process, it truly is like a black hole. It sucks away your time while you track your candidates, and in the past, there's been virtually no status information. Waste your time, waste the candidate's time, elongates your time to fill, and potentially you could lose some candidates that you've worked really hard to try and get to work for your organization. So what we've announced is an integrated we have available today for our clients on our next slide is we have drug integrations that put you more in control of your day. So as you can see by the icons here, starting at the registration, concluding with the result, there are a number of process notifications now available due to the fact that we have built integrations with our drug screening partners. Next chart. And all of these particular status updates and process notifications would be available to you in the Orange Tree candidate portal. We have integrations today with Quest and eScreen, and as you can see, not all integrations are the same. We have taken the same methodology, the same approach in working with each of these providers to ensure that we can capture as much information as we can at this time. And you can see that there's a bit more information available via an eScreen approach versus Quest at this moment. Next chart. We have had this capability available now for about 90 days or so. And out of the gate, we were one of our early adopters of this technology was Craig Therapeutics. And as you can see here, a quote from Susan Cronin, our integrations have just made a huge difference to them, to her and her team, as they process candidates through that final stage in the hiring process, saving them a ton of time, providing them a ton of visibility, and allowing them to move on to the work at hand, which they need to perform, which the last thing they want to do is training users in a background check, the drug training process, and then having to track that via phone calls and whatnot. So proof point there for you, and hopefully something that would be of interest to you. If so, reach out to let us know how we can help you provide more information on that. Quick blurb, non-drug test, just a quick announcement. We offer continuous monitoring across the board, virtually all of our services, and probably of note is the criminal continuous monitoring, maybe something that you haven't talked yet to your Orange Tree rep about. We invite you to do so. I just think as we continue to move forward with all of the prevailing circumstances in our society and expectations and whatnot, I think if you haven't looked at criminal monitoring and much less some of the other services, now really is the time to do so, and we can provide a solution to help you out. Final chart from me, just a quick update on our integrations. You'll see 3 stars appear here next to iCIMS, SAP SuccessFactors, and Talent Reef. Briefly on iCIMS, we did do a webinar recently announcing our partnership with them, the delivery of the Prime connector for the iCIMS Recruit ATS module. A lot of excitement, a lot of interest around that integration. We have more than a half dozen clients up in production today, and there's more to come. We're having a lot of conversations. If we haven't talked to you yet, We would look forward to do so. We welcome that. And it's not a straightforward process to move from an existing version of an ISOMS connector to the Prime connector. There are some things you want to be aware of, and as a beta developer, we know all of the ins and outs of that, and would be very delighted to speak with you to ensure that you know exactly how to move forward and the timing of that move, if that is something that you're considering, and if you're not on ISOMS today, you're considering that platform, that the same information, the same value, the same consultative approach is available from Orange Tree, of course. SAP SuccessFactors, we've actually had that up and running for a couple of quarters, just to the delight of our clients. We haven't had a chance to talk about it, so I just wanted to highlight it in case you haven't seen that. And then Talent Brief is relatively new here in the last quarter. So if you'd like to learn more about these integrations, any of the integrations you see on the chart or others, this is a sampling of the technology and integrations that we deliver today. Again, please contact us. So that concludes my portion of today's seminar. It gives me great pleasure to turn things over to Nina French. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you. And everyone, I appreciate Orange Tree having me here today. I always like to talk to an audience about what's happening in the drug testing industry. And so if you're like Jeff and I, caught in the snow with some probably kids at home somewhere, we appreciate you joining today. And so we've got about 50 minutes to go over this agenda. It seems very small, but what you're going to find is this is actually pretty meaty. So what we're going to cover is marijuana legislation or legalization updates, sort of some of the legislations, and what are the issues with it. Then we're going to hit a little bit on opioids and prescription drugs and use versus abuse, which seems simple, but it's really not. And then we're going to talk a little bit about SAMHSA changes and the impact and how, even if you're not in a regulated environment or you're not regulated employer, how that impacts you. And so really chock full. It seems like 50 minutes is a long time. I'm not really going to have a chance to take a breath. But what I do want to say is Orange Tree invited me. You can see all the work they're doing to give you an integrated platform. It's complicated, right? As Jeff just pointed out in his slides, even these integrations, if you are in HR, you understand how critical it is to work with a provider who gets the integrations, who's got it, makes it a little bit easier for you. What you've got to understand is drug testing is complicated. What I always say is work with somebody who makes it easier for you. And, that's why Orange Tree brings us in to help you understand what's happening. I've been in this in 26 years. I like to pretend I started when I was a baby. And it is busier and more complicated than it has ever been before. And that's both good and bad. But if you are in HR or safety, what it means for you is you've got to be paying attention like you never have before. And that's for a myriad of different reasons. The first is what we'll start with, right? Marijuana legislation. You cannot turn on the nightly news and not hear something about marijuana legalization, legislation happening in your states. And this audience, I don't know before, when we're making these slides and working with Orange Tree for the presentation, I don't know who's going to be on this call. I'm guessing that you're in HR, you're in safety, you're in compliance in your job. And so what we try to do is design these not just to be informative, but to give you something that you walk out of this training and you can say, all right, yeah, I got a to-do list. So you should have your pen in your hand if you don't have your pen in your hand. Or if you're one of those people who can actually type notes, then you should be doing that as well. Because it's important that you walk away from this with something that's actionable. And that's how we're presenting this information for you. So you're going to see a lot of stuff on these slides that are, we're going to go through quickly, but take away the information and know that we can provide you with details if you need them for, these slides and what we've presented. But let's start with marijuana, right? Marijuana is now legal in 33 states. And the District of Columbia. And there's been no state that has passed recreational marijuana without having first passed medicinal marijuana. What's passed is important. What's legal is important. If you live in that state, I'm sure you're well aware of what's happening. But I think what we want to really make sure that you understand today is what it means and why it's different, because it is very different than any other drug that we are dealing with in the United States. And that is just for this reason. The reason is it's both recreational and medicinal. And so, and by the way, right, it's recreational, it's medicinal, and it's illegal at a federal level. So you really, as an HR person who's in charge of policy and hiring, have to understand what that means. You can no longer, like 10 years ago when everybody didn't see this train coming down the tracks, people were saying it's never going to get legalized. It's certainly never going to be legalized below the Mason-Dixon line. Well, take a look at the map. It's legal in many different states. Because it's federally illegal, you used to be able to say it's a Schedule I drug, and so we're just going to rely on the federal drug testing on it being a Schedule I drug and illegal. But you can no longer do that. We're seeing that change in 2018 and 2019 with case laws and the way that the laws are being written in each of these different states. So if you look at what passed in 2018, you'll see that, we had a number of states where they passed medicinal marijuana, and then we had several who passed recreational marijuana. But each of those states, like all drug testing laws, right, each of those states vary in the way that they have legalized it. And so if you have an office in those states, you have a presence in those states, then you've got to understand what's the difference between, let's say, Delaware's recreation or medicinal marijuana law and Louisiana's marijuana law. And how is recreational marijuana going to be handled in Maine versus Michigan? What does it mean? So Delaware, for instance, that was an expansion in August. They expanded medical marijuana to include chronic debilitating migraines. So additional things that you can be, quote unquote, prescribed marijuana for. Whereas Louisiana passed HB 627 in May, and they have no employment conditions mentioned in the law. So you've got to be really careful and understand as you go through each of these what you can and can't do. Maine, we saw one of the most restrictive and dangerous laws for employers because an employer may not refuse to employ or otherwise penalize a person solely for that person's status as a qualifying patient, right? You also can't refuse to employ a person who's 21 years or older because they've consumed marijuana outside of the workplace. That's the tricky part. Be working with Orange Tree, be talking about the difference between impairment, right? What are you measuring? And each of the different drug testing methodologies have different windows of detection. So in Maine, hair testing would be very tricky, right? You would really have a difficult reason to deny employment because hair testing looks back 45 days. Urine looks back, week, 10 days, 15 days, depending. Oral fluid looks back for about 48 hours. And so you've got to be really aware in those different states which one is the right option for you. And you have to also be aware that it doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all. So depending on how your policy is written and which states you do business, you can adopt different testing methodologies for different reasons for tests, right? Pre-employment can be different than post-accident or reasonable suspicion drug testing. You can also be looking at different methods of testing in different states. So, oral fluid or instant testing, we just talked about instant with Jeff, like where is that a better option for you, in what states or for what reasons to test? So designing and looking at the foundational purposes for your program is really important. And if you haven't done that in a long time and you've just kind of been status quo, it's important to look at that. It's also super important now because of both the, prescription drug issues we're seeing and because of marijuana. It's critical that you think about both pre-employment testing, and then you think about pre-access testing, right? Are you testing people when they come onto a job site, especially if it's safety sensitive? And then be thinking as well about post-hire testing. Much of your cost and liability as an employer comes, just like Jeff was saying in his slide about that continuous monitoring, right? Drug testing is a piece of that. You want to know if someone is on the job impaired, if they are using on your job. And the easy way to do that is look at post-hire testing, a little bit of random testing, right? So it's what we call sort of fear of God, right? The fear of God. You put that out and it becomes a deterrent to the workforce so that people who are chronic drug users or who are having addiction issues don't come to your workplace. And those who may consider using recreationally are going to say, look, I'm not going to. I don't want to go to work. I don't know if taking this edible is going to make me stoned on the job, and I don't want to risk my job because there's a chance when I show up, they're going to pull me for a random. And if they do, I don't want to be on the job high. And so it's really important to be thinking about post-accident, reasonable suspicion, and random drug testing to balance out an overall testing program. Critical. And by the way, remember that the cost of doing that is often paid for by denying one workers' comp claim, right, because of a positive drug test. Preventing one accident or injury, right? Those things are really important when you're looking at, if you're in charge of those claims and monitoring those claims, and you're also in charge of the drug testing program, look at what you paid out in one workers' comp claim and what you could save if you could deny that. And so it's important to look at those and to look at, frankly, what the penetration is in all of those kinds of programs to see if, just pay for a testing program, deter use, and see where those claims drop. As I said, it's complicated, and so it's also important to look at some of these cases that we're seeing. Now, the Nossinger case was important because a plaintiff was offered a position contingent upon a pre-employment test. I am not a lawyer, not a doctor either, by the way. I'm just a drug testing expert. This is what I've done forever. And so I'm not going to explain this to you. If you're a lawyer on the phone and you want to look it up, you're in compliance and you want to look it up, there's ample opportunity to look this up on and read the details. What I'm going to tell you is what it means for you as an employer. And what happened in this case is the plaintiff was a registered medical marijuana user and tested positive for marijuana. And so they rescinded the job offer. They filed suit in Connecticut, and Connecticut is one of these states where we're seeing them lean much more pro. And we're going to explain again why that's sort of dicey area. In 2017, the U.S. District Court for Connecticut came in and they said, this employee is allowed to sue. They didn't give a ruling, but they said they could sue. And then in 2018, we saw a summary judgment. And a summary judgment is based upon a motion that says, one of the parties has all the stuff they need, all the necessary factual issues are settled. And so it can be tried, right? And so what do you have to take away from this decision? The most obvious change is that employers in Connecticut, or if you're doing business in Connecticut, you have to, even if you are abiding by the Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act, because that was what it was at issue here. If you're abiding by it, I seem to have an issue here. If you're abiding by that law, you can't just rely on it. And the reason was because the Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act doesn't require drug testing. And it doesn't say that employees should be fired if they use drugs outside of the workplace. So again, really idiosyncratic, really deep understanding of how Connecticut happened to decide in this case, but it's going to dictate drug testing. And these cases, as they're settled, we're going to see the laws change and adapt. And so again, if you're seeing laws come up in your state, it's super important that you get active, because drug abuse in the United States costs about $400 billion per year, and 70% of that is borne by employers. So if you think it's not costing you money, you're wrong. You're just plain old wrong. So you're going to see continued legislation across the United States. You're going to see possible movement with the federal government. We don't know. Sessions is out. We may see how marijuana is scheduled being changed. We're going to be looking very closely at CBD versus THC. And plain and simple, CBD is cannabidiol. It does not, at its essence, get you high. Has no psychoactive properties. THC is what gets you high. So you're going to have to understand the difference between that. You're going to have to be working with the MROs at Orange Tree to understand what those differences are and how you're going to address them in your policy. And then you've got to be active at looking at these court cases, because they're directly going to affect policy and law. What's important about marijuana, we said this in the very beginning, is it is all things, right? So marijuana is an umbrella of a bunch of different metabolites. What we don't know right now is how it really works. So we see, because it's not regulated, right, you can't really have a prescription for marijuana. There's a few cases where they're like Marinol and Dronabinol, where there are legal remedies, and there's a real prescription where the drug passed FDA clearance, right? Meaning they went through all those clinical trials that we know for prescription drugs, but almost in no other case has that. Is there a prescription allowed for marijuana? And so even though people are saying that, there's no prescription. So your policy has to address that. There's differences in how it hits you, right? So it isn't like your bottle of Tylenol. I was talking to Suzanne and Jeff before the webinar started. I have 4 kids, right? And you remember, as these, as they were different ages, I had like 1,000 different Tylenols in my house, right? I had twins who are 11. I have a 16-year-old, and I've got one in the middle. And so I had the little dropper of Tylenol when they were babies. And then if one weighed more, then you had to go up to the children's Tylenol, and you looked at that thing and you rolled out what it told me, how much to dose, how to dose it, how often to give it to them. And then you had, adult Tylenol. You had Tylenol with codeine if you had a tooth pulled. You had Tylenol PM if you're having trouble sleeping and you had a backache, right? We don't know any of that about marijuana. Wild, Wild West. Again, even in the states where it's legal, both recreationally and medicinally, there are no standards, not even the standards we see in those over-the-counter drugs like Tylenol. So what we don't know is, and what you can't tell for your employees is, right, did they smoke it? Did they use an edible? Did they take a concentrate? Johns Hopkins University did a study in the 90s, and they found that like 4 puffs of smokable marijuana. Now, granted, right? You don't know. You don't know if it's the skunky weed somebody grew in on their balcony, or if it's this like high-powered stuff that's being sold and cultivated by horticulturalists in California and Colorado. That's phenomenally strong. In this study in 95, they found that 4 puffs of smokable marijuana with a 1.75% of THC translated to about 57 nanograms per milliliter, right? That translates in 10 puffs to about 100 nanograms or 99 nanograms per milliliter. Well, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says levels of 100 to 200 nanograms are routinely encountered, right? So you don't know, is it an edible that gets in someone's system a little bit slower but stays in longer? Did they smoke something really strong 3 days ago before they showed up on the job? What we don't know is what the drug dose is, right? How much did they take? What kind did they smoke? How strong was it? Did they smoke it or vape it? Did they use oils, or was it like infused in a food or drink? We don't know the duration, right? We don't know how often they use it or how long it's going to stay in the system. We don't know what their metabolic rate is. And then based on those different tests you're using, the test sensitivity, it could have a lower cutoff level or a higher cutoff level, and the window on the specificity is different. So you got to really learn all of this. And I don't expect you all on this audience to be experts, but the team at Orange Tree is. And so based on what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it, they can help you design a program that meets your needs. They've got all of those integrations. They've got a wide variety of different tests, and they know how and when it's good for your place of business to use them. What we do know is that many of you are concerned about it. 66% are concerned about it. And you're concerned, and this is a study that CCG actually does every year. We just got in the results for this year, and we'll be publishing them as well. But I don't expect this one to go down. I expect it to go up. You're concerned about the decrease in quality of candidates and employees. You're concerned about the increased costs to you, right? Again, no one, whatever your opinion is about legalization of marijuana, if you are responsible in any way, shape, or form for the bottom line at your business, the idea of stopping drug testing should make you stop in your tracks. Even though unemployment is low, even though there are idiosyncratic pieces of marijuana, if you're responsible for that bottom line, you need to be looking at your policy, you need to be looking at your program, and you need to be thinking about how do you continue testing. And again, continue testing different ways, different methods, different panels. Look at what it is and think about the different ways that you can continue testing, like we said, right? Post-hire testing, because these are the costs. That $400 million, that number came before we had such amazing access to marijuana. And it's not like, I'm not here to say it's evil, right? I won't tell you guys what my theory is and what my opinion is from a personal perspective, but I know as a small business owner that these kinds of costs can kill me. And so I need to continue to test, right? Know what the costs are. Some of them are easier to measure than others, right? Workers' comp claims, super easy. Driver accidents, if you've got drivers, super easy. These things like careless mistake, erratic work patterns, absenteeism, turnover. Turnover is crazy. The difference in turnover is amazing. Between a drug user and a non-drug user, not just marijuana, but drug users. And so you'd see the turnover go from about almost double or triple for drug users. And so that's a cost, hard to measure, but it's a cost. So think about it when you're looking at drug use. Think about it when you're seeing these different states propose legalization. These are the states that are the top 10 in highest marijuana positivity rates in 2017, right? That's a high number. You guys are probably seeing even higher, but that's a high number. These are the ones that have the highest positivity rates in metropolitan areas. And so again, these are places where you could very well have a high concentration of employees. And if you're seeing that high of a positivity rate in what is likely to be mostly pre-employment testing, then users are very likely to start using immediately after the drug test has been done. So again, another reason for post-hire drug testing. And again, I could talk about this for 4 hours, and we could talk a whole lot about all of the structure, but we're moving on to the next topic so that you understand, but you've got to really be active in all of this. And as an employer, you've got to be active in your state about what the position is and how you're going to adapt to it. Now we're going to do the pile-on, right? Right? Yeah. You ever get into a fight with a significant other, you tend to get in this mode of piling on. Well, I'm about to pile on for you because we're going to talk about the opioid update and prescription drug use versus abuse, because you're kind of in a little bit of the same boat. So this slide shows you the U.S. state of prescription drug testing rates. This is 2017, right? So for every 100 people in, I'm going to pick on West Virginia, for every 100 people, there are in excess of 107.1 opioid prescriptions in that state in 2017. This is years after we've recognized the magnitude of the opioid epidemic in this country, right? If you go to the very best states, Pennsylvania, I'm in Pennsylvania, we are a little bit under 64 for every 100 people. So it's a significant issue. There's no chance this isn't affecting your workplace in some way. So how are you dealing with it in your workplace? Well, we did the same study and we asked about concern for safety due to prescription drug use. 69% of you are concerned, right? This doesn't change. It's not exactly the same as what we saw with marijuana, but we've seen, extremely concerned, slightly concerned, not concerned at all. If you're not concerned at all, I'm just pretty amazed. Maybe you just read the question wrong. Not sure. Same question, right? Are you concerned about the decreased quality of candidates' employees? And the answer is yes. A lot of you are concerned. So when you combine this with marijuana use, you're seeing that a lot of you are concerned, but you're caught between a rock and a hard place because you're concerned about the quality. If you bring somebody on at a lower quality, you're going to see issues with performance. You're going to see issues with some of those things like absenteeism, right? And decreased work quality and productivity if they're drug users in the workplace. But if you don't hire them, you've got a vacancy. It's tough. So you've got to really try to work with your provider to say, how do I keep adapting my program to keep up with these ever-changing times? The cost concern, again, main concerns are workers' comp, healthcare, litigation costs. It is important for you to understand that the litigation alone for marijuana is likely to be the most expensive thing that we have seen in this country for the next 20 years. If you think as an HR professional on the phone, think back to FMLA. That was dropped in our laps over 20 years ago, and then employers paid the litigation costs to figure it all out for the past 20 years. Nobody who's collecting the tax revenue in your state pays you back for those legal costs when you get sued. So really important to be active about all of these things and be aware of it because you're going to bear those costs. And then again, downstream, right, you're going to see those healthcare costs as they go up. It is important to be aware of it all. It's difficult to manage it, but you've got to be thinking about what are you going to do. So look at your drug panel, right? Are you adding additional prescription drugs? When we're talking about opioids, think back in those states. If you were in one of the states that had the highest concentration and you're listening to your local news every night and you're hearing how severe your problem is, are you looking at adding additional drug tests to your panel? It is oftentimes an inexpensive way to, again, deter drug use. You can modify your panel periodically. You can also modify your panel for reason for tests. So in pre-employment, you may do one thing with addition of prescription drugs, but I don't know why you wouldn't add it for some of these others, right? Random, reasonable suspicion, post-accident, return to duty. Important to be looking at that panel. Did you add expanded opioids? Know what your panel covers. A lot of people think it covers everything, and it doesn't. A 5-drug panel, when the DOT, and we're going to talk about that at the end section, but when the DOT changed their panel, they changed from opiates to opioids. I should be able to say that in my sleep. Opiates to opioids. And they added some of these semi-synthetic drugs like hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, oxymorphone that you're hearing about all the time. They always had heroin in it. Even though it's a 5-drug panel, there's actually 14 different drugs that are tested. But if you have a concern in your local area about a certain drug, make sure it's covered in your panel, right? Make sure you're actually testing for it if it's something you're hearing about. in your local area. There's been a dramatic increase in the use of controlled substances to treat chronic pain, right? Anxiety, depression. You've got to understand what's being used and if you're testing for it. You also have to understand, like I said, that the DOT expanded the federal drug testing panel. And so we've seen that, and it was in a direct response to this drug epidemic, right? We also know that there are new drugs that are coming on the market, hundreds and hundreds of them, and they have impairing effects. So do you want to, right? Does your panel test? I'm going to ask this question. If you're sitting there listening to this in your office, raise your hand, right? Does your drug testing panel test for Adderall? I'm guessing no. Is that an issue? I don't know. I don't know what you do in your workplace. Only you do. And so is the effects of Adderall or Adderall abuse an issue? The answer might be no. If you've got pharmacy access or people who are dealing with sick, injured, and you're in healthcare, maybe you want to think about it, because drug theft is a huge issue. Do you want to be sending people in your home healthcare out to be in let's say a nursing home where there's tons of drugs available and they're stealing them? No, you don't want to. So be thinking about that, right? Think about all of the different drugs that are available and how you're testing for them. Think about whether, the medication interactions are known with all of the different drugs, right? So if somebody's getting a drug from one doctor and then not going to the other doctor, or going to another doctor and pill shopping, you got to be thinking about all of those things. As your population's aging, you've got to be thinking about more drugs. And then, now you can get prescribed drugs over the phone, not narcotics generally, but are you testing for them? So it's important to be thinking about all of those different things. And again, what's the level of safety sensitivity? And as you're defining your policy, be mindful of that as well. Safety sensitive is often thought of as pilots, truck drivers, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I would challenge that in businesses like financial, cybersecurity, home health care. Those are people working with children. Those are safety sensitive. Can you define them and then manage your policy and your testing programs around those as well? Looking at your workplace, how are you defining safety sensitive? And then again, how are you going to test them? Is it going to be the same or different as everyone else in your workplace? Really important to get creative now, because again, you can't, I always, again, I've been in this industry since right before it started, or right after it started. The idea of a drug-free workplace always makes me giggle. A drug-free workplace means no one is taking a leave, right? You're not doing it. That's drug-free. No one's, technically, it means I would get fired from every job I've ever had because I'm pretty much a caffeine addict, right? So is it your drug-free workplace to get rid of impairing substance, drug abuse? What is it for? What's the definition? Why are you doing the drug testing in the first place? Work with that first and then say, am I doing all the right things? Am I training, right? So we're going to talk about use and abuse, but am I training? Work with Orange Tree to look at all of those different things, because that's what a drug-free workplace is, right? We're doing pre-employment testing to assess our candidates and to hopefully deter and weed out chronic drug users, right? We want a good match, because bringing them on, hiring them, training them, getting them up and running, you're really like 6 months in usually before you're getting them really the full return on that investment. And it takes a while to get the return on the investment. As you're hiring more technical, higher level employees, the return on investment and turnover costs can be 300% and 400%, right? If you've got to turn over a job and rehire at those high level jobs. So you really want to get a good match for your workplace. Once you've got them in there, you want to deter use that's going to cost you those costs we lined up, right? Everything from accidents and incidents to absenteeism, higher penetration of your health care and your benefits, all of those different things. The challenge, much like marijuana, we talked about all of the challenge between, is it a drug? Is it, marijuana it's the only drug we've got in the United States right now that is both recreational and medicinal. And the hard part about that is, if your approach is, hey, I think marijuana is less addictive and less of a problem in the United States than alcohol, then I'd say I agree with you right now. Give it time, right? We're seeing the levels of THC in marijuana increase. It's triple and quadruple what it was when I was, smoking pot in high school, right? If I don't lie to my kids, right? I tried it in high school. I didn't love it. Why didn't I love it? Because it made me paranoid. Why did it make me paranoid? Because it didn't have enough CBD in it. So when we're starting to see, so I stopped, right? Didn't like it. Tried it, didn't like it. When you start going to levels of THC at 60% and 50% and zero CBD, we're going to be seeing things like emergency visits increase. We're going to be seeing accidents. We're already seeing accidents increase because people don't know when you take an edible, right? You don't know if you're drinking a glass of wine, if you're having a double scotch, or if you're doing shots of Everclear. So we're seeing the impact of all of those things now in the states where it's legal, and you're going to see that impact. So it's important that you're looking at your overall drug-free workplace program and designing it so that you've got feet on the street. Your employees know what you're testing. They know that what your rules are. You've trained your supervisors on symptoms and signs. You've got a way to document use in the office. What are you going to do? I hate to use the word confront, but how do you confront as a supervisor an employee? Cases have been won or lost on things like that. So again, if you're in HR and safety, you want to be training all your supervisors and your managers to understand how to identify the signs and symptoms of use in the workplace. And then what do you do, right? What do you do? How do you document it? Because you don't want to say, Jeff seemed high on marijuana, and then he comes back with a negative for marijuana, but a positive for PCP. I'd be really impressed, Jeff, if you could do your job, but we see those things. So how you interact and, how your supervisors interact is really important, but the training also provides you invaluable sets of eyes, right? So that they can know what to do, and then you've got documentation working with Orange Tree to, bring in people if you need to, do instant testing technology if you need to know right then what's happening, right? Think about all of those different things when you're designing your program. And then finally, you want to think about this idea of use versus abuse. So drug testing in workplace is like a pregnancy test, right? When you take a pregnancy test as a woman, it just tells you you're pregnant. It doesn't tell you that you are brand new, super excited, and news. This is great news. You can't wait to tell people. Or are you about to go into labor? It just says you're pregnant, right? Workplace drug testing is the same. It tells you positive or negative. What it doesn't, and no MRO, no one at Orange Tree is able to tell you, is it use or abuse when it comes to many of the drugs that you're testing for. So again, super important to be thinking about how you're designing your program, right? You don't know if I am taking my I'll go back to my Tylenol, right? My Tylenol with codeine as prescribed by the doctor because I had a tooth pulled, or if I'm abusing it. Now, in some cases you do. So I picked on Jeff and said, let's talk about PCP, right? There's no legal use for PCP. So he's abusing PCP. Easy. When you come to some of these, it's not so easy. And it's very difficult, unless you have a really well done program, to understand use versus abuse. So again, you want to be working with this crew and saying, hey, are there options? Are there back on track programs? If somebody goes into rehab through our healthcare, is there a way that we can bring them back? Because we paid and they're a great employee. They got tangled up in all of this, and so we want to bring them back. If we bring them back, what would you do? You'd use a substance abuse professional to help you define how to bring them back. What was the issue? How often do you test? Can you continue to test them while they're in your employment? Sometimes those drug users, people who are in recovery, are the best employees you've got, right? They're the best ones you've got. So you want to be thinking about all of those different things, because the drug test isn't going to necessarily tell you when that line has been crossed between use and abuse. If you, again, have a workplace where there's safety-sensitive issues and concerns, you want to be really strongly thinking about drug disclosure programs, and that's a long, different discussion, but you want to be thinking about drug disclosure policies in your workplace. And in a nutshell, that works in your post-employment testing program as part of your policy. And you say, hey, look, if we have a reason, meaning you're in a safety-sensitive position, if we have a reason that you cannot come into work under the influence of a drug, your responsibility as an employee of our company is to take your job description to your prescribing physician. And I would say to my prescribing physician, hey, I'm managing partner of Current Consulting Group. You're about to give me a prescription for Tylenol 3 with codeine. Here's my job description. Can I do this job while I'm taking this drug as it is prescribed by me? And the doctor would say, yeah, you can do it. Just make sure you don't seem loopy, right? You could probably do it. And the concept that you're going to cost your employer money or harm it's low, right? However, if you're driving children around, right? If you're in charge of high finance, if you are operating a forklift, if you have access, right? You have pharmacy access. If you're doing that home health care, if you're doing cybersecurity, maybe the answer is no. Now, I gave you a pretty sedate drug, right? Tylenol with codeine. But what if I was taking 5 milligrams of oxycodone every 4 hours? I got news for you. I'd be loopy. I probably shouldn't come to work. And so what the prescribing physician does with your employee in that case is work to define, can they take it or can they not? If they can't, then their obligation is to come to you as an employer. They don't have to disclose what they're taking or why they're taking it. They have to come to you and say, I can't do my job right now. And then you go into that, FMLA, ADA, what can you do? Can you make accommodations? Could they go on leave or not? But it becomes an HR issue, not a lawsuit. That's the way you want to design a good program. And so then finally, because we're at about 10 minutes of, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this idea. It seems like a little bit of a non sequitur, but there's an important reason to do this. As we're talking about design, panels, issues, keeping abreast of the laws, it's important to know that even if you are a non-regulated employer, the fact that SAMHSA changed their guidelines and is going to continue to change their guidelines is important to you, whether or not you are a DOT employer. And this is why. So I mentioned in the very beginning that marijuana laws are like drug testing laws in general. There are different types of drug testing laws. There are mandatory laws. There are voluntary laws. There are mandatory laws that affect only industry-specific industries. So the mining industry in West Virginia, there's specific laws you have to abide by. I keep mentioning home health care. That's another one, right? So there are different laws in different states. Some states like California have no laws, except in San Francisco, where they do, because they think they're their own little place, and that's great. So there are different laws there, right? Or there's laws in San Francisco, but not in the state. But there are case laws that affect what you should do. It's not always black and white, but sometimes it is. As an employer, you may say, we want to use all of the 14 states that have voluntary workers' compensation premium discounts. Our premiums are huge, and so we want to take advantage of that in those states. Others of you will say, no, we don't want to. And so you've got to know what they are. What you also have to know is that SAMHSA has mandatory guidelines for federal workplace drug testing. And those drug testing laws affect 20 states because they, even though they don't have any rules, they don't have any authority over it, the states referenced SAMHSA, DOT, or that drug testing panel in that state. So sometimes you'll note that you can or can't do a certain drug test in a state because you have to do what SAMHSA says, right? Because, again, that state law references these guidelines. They change all the time. Be aware of it. A big proposed change is that they are looking to update the mandatory federal guidelines, just like they did last year, right? They updated it and they said you can use an electronic chain of custody, and that made every DOT employer in the world happy. They also expanded that definition of opiates to opioids and added those drugs, changed a little bit of other things in there as well. If you are in one of those states that references those guidelines, then you had to have changed your panel. So, you had to make that change. So be aware of that. Be aware that they first proposed in May of 2015 the provision to add oral fluids, and then they talked about hair testing. It's still pending. It was supposed to be done by December 31st, 2018. It would allow employers who are regulated by the mandatory guidelines to implement oral fluid testing, which means that, they usually align with DOT shortly after. The government shutdown actually delayed that December 31st, but we expect to see that happening soon, and that's an option for you then as well. And again, this support act that came down by the federal government, it was 70 different little acts, and it affected a whole bunch of different things. So some of it had nothing to do with workplace drug testing, like no mailing of fentanyl, grants for recovery centers, first responder access. Others, it did. So research into the workforce impact of drugs in general, like we said, hair and oral fluid guidelines, electronic record keeping guidelines. So that support act was pretty huge. I forget what it was, but my staff was none too happy when it came out because it was like 600 pages and we had to digest it and publish on it in 24 hours. It was a big conglomerate of 70 different laws. So understand that it's those 70 different smaller bills, but it was a bipartisan effort aimed at combating opioid crisis and then looking at the impact of legalized marijuana in the workplace. And that's going to affect you. So again, if you're in these states, I mentioned, what did I mention? West Virginia, mining, Wisconsin, public works, right? They require compliance with the SAMHSA guidelines, and therefore you'd be permitted to allow oral fluid, or you'd be required in many of those instances to modify your drug testing panel to meet the SAMHSA guidelines. Some of them, by the way, have it as like a minimum and you can add. Some have it as a very strict requirement of what tests you can do. So it's really important to understand all of those different things and abide by them. And so we're about 3-4 minutes out. I do want to remind you that the presentation did, if you stayed on for the whole thing, qualify for SHRM, CCDAP, and HRCI credits. And so with that, Suzanne, I'm going to turn it over to you to wrap up with information. The information on how to get the CEU credits is here, but I'll turn it over to you to wrap up and conclude our webinar today.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Nina. Just a reminder to everyone that we will have both the slides and the recording of the webinar available afterwards. We'll provide them to all of you so you have them. thank you everyone for joining. I do see, Nina, if you mind answering a couple of questions, we got some really good ones.
Nope, we've got 3 minutes. Let's do it.
Okay, perfect. First one, we'll just jump right in. What does the X cup test for compared to a urine drug screen? She says, to my knowledge, they test for different drugs.
The X cup versus urine screen?
Yeah.
The X cup is actually a urine test. So it's a test, and Orange Tree, and Jeff, feel free to jump in if you need to, but Orange Tree makes it available through that integration with eScreen. It is actually a urine test, but it's an instrument-read instant test. So those of you who are looking at an instant test where you're interpreting the results, this is available in different collection facilities, and it gives you an instant read. So by the time that employee goes back, the machine has read the drug test. If it's positive, it goes on for confirmation. If it's negative, you get the results through your integration really before the guy's back from the test. And the X cup is just an expanded panel. It used to just be that 5 panel, but now it has additional drugs. And I'm sure whoever asked the question can get the specific list of drugs and cutoff levels. I don't know them off the top of my head, but that's what it is.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Nina. Another question: does random testing need a certain amount of people and not just one person?
Random drug testing does not need a certain amount of people, but right, you can't really be. You could theoretically be random and put one person in a pool and just see if they get picked. It's almost impossible to pull that off. But most people, when they're set in that like owner operator type of environment, they enter a consortium. So you can work with Orange Tree and enter a consortium of other small companies, and you pick from that pool based on the rules of the consortium. If you're talking about someone who specifically, that's not random, right? If you're talking about someone who specifically has an issue and you want to do testing, that's actually follow-up testing at random. And there are programs that can do that. So it's a pool of one, but it's random selection of follow-up testing. And you'd work with Orange Tree, and we could work with you to explain how to do that. But if that's the question, then that's a little bit of a different thing, but also available and done. And I really actually very much recommend looking at those types of programs. Back on Track, last chance agreements, working with substance abuse professionals to define what that would be like. And again, those are very specialized, because what they would say is, if Nina was just using her husband's Tylenol 3 with codeine and took it on a business trip, they do a full assessment, and they'd say, all right, here's what her follow-up testing protocol should be. One test a month on any given random day for the first year, and then after that, one test every quarter, versus somebody who, maybe was a heroin addict and was in and out of rehab a couple of times, and then they would come back with a much more extensive testing a program for that person, and you'd work then to generate randoms according to that kind of a schedule.
Okay, perfect. And then our last question from Tom: what is the best resource for marijuana laws and interpretations?
Oh, well, I don't know who Tom is, but it sounds like I planted this question. Actually, and I hope you guys don't mind, Suzanne, but at CCG we actually do have it's called currentcompliance.org, and that is what we do. It's a membership website, and we track it. There's a fee associated with it. We can get you a discount through Orange Tree if you're interested. Other than that, you have to really just kind of dig into all of the different, Google searches and put it in and kind of sort through it. Our website does that for you, but you can do it for free in other ways, and really that's what you have to do, unless you want to pay for like a legal service that notifies you of the changes, and I don't know any others.
Okay, perfect, and we're happy to help with those conversations as well. Well, we are just a couple minutes over the time, but Nina, thank you so much for the great conversation, the really informative updates, and thank you all for joining today.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.